Good morning and welcome back into Take 5, the podcast where we talk about G5, 365. We are exclusively dealing with those group of five conferences and mid-majors for basketball and baseball as well. My name is Tyler Hill. That's Connor Young. Connor, how you doing?
Doing good, man. How was your 4th of July? How'd you celebrate Independence Day yesterday?
Well, I stained a deck for about 4 hours.
Okay.
So that was a big thing for me. And then my fiance Mia actually surprised me. She was supposed to get in on the 6th this Saturday, and
Oh,
she moved her flight up and surprised me and everything. So that was
that's
awesome.
awesome.
But then we watched a little bit of fireworks from our deck, but we
Yeah.
got a huge rainstorm at about 7 or 7:30, and so it made it where fireworks were pretty tough for this area. But it's still a good fourth. How about you?
I spent mine at the ballpark. We also had a little bit of a rain out just for an hour or so. So we had a delayed start, but all the fans stuck it out over at the Hillcats ballpark
There
here
you
in
go.
Lynchburg. So yeah, it was cool. At the ballpark, not a bad way for me to spend my 4th of July. So it was good.
No, it feels like a traditional American way to just go to the 4th of July game and hang out and have a good time. So glad it ended up
Yes.
working out for you. Well, today, the main meat of our podcast is going to be ranking the G5 conferences in football. So we've talked a little bit about different conferences in dealing with teams and like, hey, they have a tough schedule, they have a weak schedule, they might need to go undefeated because their conference schedule is so weak. So we're going to give you our full rankings right after we go through some news. So there has been a decent amount of news, especially centered around Utah State. Their coach, Blake Anderson, was just fired by the athletic department. So this is according to Utah State. It is allegedly for Title IX violations in relation to reporting sexual
Yep.
assault. And so they weren't reported fast enough or weren't reported at all is the alleged thing that he messed up on. Nate Dreiling is who's taking over. He was the defensive coordinator for Utah State, and he will be the interim coach going into this upcoming season. They also fired, Utah State also fired Associate Vice President Jerry Bovee, and then Football Director of Player Development and Community Alston Albrecht, because they, in the chain of passing things up, also would be complicit with that. So with it being July 5th and you are in the meat of your summer program and your head coach gets fired, Connor, what do you think is realistic expectations for Utah State? Maybe not even a win number, but just can they keep it together as an organization?
Yeah, for Utah State, the roster, it was all right, not exactly fantastic. And I think they were going to have a hard time competing for a Mountain West title this year regardless. But now with this, yeah, that makes it a whole lot tougher. It's going to be a tough job. Luckily, they kept the job in the organization, which you would expect they would with something as last minute as this. But at least there's some familiarity there. They're not bringing in someone new and having to learn a completely new system. But one thing I will say, the sidebar, good for Utah State for taking action. This is something that I think we see way too often in college football programs is stuff like this. And oftentimes there is a little bit of a delay in reporting and stuff like this. And for them to crack down and their hand might have been forced, so maybe giving the school credit is a little naive for me. But still, I think it's a good sign that it's a no-tolerance policy in that regard. But yeah, it's going to be a long road for them to have to overcome this obstacle. Like you said, this is a key point where they're trying to rally the troops, get ready for the season.
Yeah, I think that is good. Like you hit on, is we don't know all the details right now, but just the fact that you are willing to do something that would clearly disadvantage your team and the program that makes the most money at the university to hold up to moral values, I do think is a good credit on top of Utah State, because he, even just from a pure record perspective, had been very successful with the Aggies. This last 2 years, not as much, but if you look at his tenure and then even what he did at Arkansas State going back to the job before, he'd been a very good coach. And so normally you would see universities try and step in front and protect coaches like that, even if it looks a little shady. So good for Utah State. It's going to be tough, man, because the Mountain West, we'll get to it, I think is a conference that has some depth to it, and especially depth in that like 5 to 7 win range, those bowl teams. I think there's a lot of them, and so when you have something like this, and that's about where I would have put Utah State going into this season, it's going to be tough because you're behind the 8 ball compared to those teams, and so now they're going to probably take advantage of you. But again, we will see when it comes to the season, and would rather them actually, do the right thing when it comes to reporting something as serious as sexual assault. Moving on here to the recruiting rankings. So official visit season is over, at least for the summer. So players will be able to take official visits in the fall to certain games. Obviously, if they have any official visits left over, for those of you who don't know, you get 5 official visits, which is visits that are completely paid for by the university, including travel, food, lodging, everything. So with that, I thought it'd be a good time to do some wrap up on where the G5 sits in recruiting. So the top 5 is going to be USF number 1, and that will be them at number 61 overall with 22 commits, 13 3-stars, and an average rating of 85.6. They're ahead of some big names, Connor. They're ahead of the University of Florida, Ole Miss, and Louisville. So just some big names, and even teams that I would say recruit well and have recruited well in the past that they're ahead of right now. What does that give you in terms of optimism for USF?
Yeah, I mean, USF, you talk about teams that they're ahead of that recruit well. I mean, they can look in their own state in Florida. That's been a powerhouse, as you know well, for the 2010s and even beyond that. For them to be above them on this list is pretty impressive for that program. But, yeah, they're set up really well. And I do think the AAC is going to be a really fun conference this year. There's a lot of good teams in that conference, and we'll kind of talk about that in just a moment. But, yeah, looking at how it shakes up, there's some good G5 programs this season. And there's a little bit of a shakeup at the end, even since we started this show. We're, 4 episodes in now. When we first started the show on our first episode, we kind of profiled the teams and what they did coming into the summer as far as recruiting goes. And now there's even some changes. There's been some more additions last minute. So looks like they're just getting better and better. Excited for this season.
Yeah, with that early signing day, man, it pushes a lot of kids' decisions up. And so you do get a lot of kids making their decisions after they take official visits in the summer because they're saying, hey, I just want to get this done before my senior season, so I'm committed. I can play out my senior season and not have to worry about it. And then even if I'm really psyched about being a USF Bull, well, now I can take this time and recruit other players as a committed prospect. So it just makes a ton of sense. I see why kids do it, and it leads to some fun stuff in the summer when there might not be as much to talk about, which is nice for us. Moving on, number 69 is going to be Toledo. They got 15 commits, so a little lighter class at this point. 9 of those 3-star with an average rating of 84.5. Number 70, Miami, Ohio, another MAC team. They have 20 commits, 9 3-stars and an average of 83.75. So a little bit less quality in terms of rating, but that bigger class helps get you up in those overall rankings. Number 71, UNLV with 11 commits, 8 3-stars and an average of 84.96. And then number 72, this one really surprised me, but ECU, Eastern Carolina, has 20 commits, 8 3-star with an average of 85.04. So of those top 5, they have the second highest average. And they're coming off a 2-10 season, which when I looked at those rankings, I could tell you I was not expecting to see ECU that high.
Yeah, I agree with you. Kind of both those last two surprised me. UNLV, not necessarily surprising as in the history for them and how they've recruited in the past, but I just don't see why that's not a bigger target for certain recruits in football. It just hasn't really seemed to be that big. Like, they haven't had that much success as far as recruiting goes. Now, the team, obviously there's some room for improvement over the last couple of years, but I don't know. You look at ECU, I think that's a case of the program wasn't very good last season, but that's just a school people want to be at. And that's in a place in the country kids want to play at. And I think UNLV is right in that same boat, even more so with how big the school is and the reputation it has. But, yeah, great for ECU to be able to break into the top 75 range. And that's a good class that they'll be bringing in next year. So, yeah, we're getting ramped up for 2024-2025 season, but it's always good to look ahead as well.
Yeah, got to be able, because listen, recruiting is the lifeblood of your program, and oftentimes it's not as true for the G5 as it is for the P4, but you can look back at recruiting rankings and transfer rankings, and you can pretty accurately predict who the top teams are going to be based off of that. It's hard to win if you don't have the guys and just dudes at the position. A couple other interesting teams I wanted to look at just in scrolling through the recruiting rankings. San Diego State came in at number 73, so they would have been sixth with 15 commits, 8 3-star, an average of 84.23. That one was interesting to me because Sean Lewis is coming in. And if you know anything about Sean Lewis, he was the offensive coordinator, well, back up even more, head coach at Kent State. And he had a very good record at Kent State for Kent State. If you know, they are one of the worst, if not the worst program historically in the G5. And if you take out his first season, which was just, first season you usually take out, he had a winning record at Kent State, which is something that is so hard to do. Goes to Colorado and is an OC, and he runs such a fun offense. They're chucking it around. They're having a ton of passing yards, and that's a really good match, I think, for California. That's the offense that a lot of high schools will run, is that, hey, we're going to get a good quarterback, we're going to get some receivers, and we are going to chuck it. So because I like the link, I think it's working in recruiting. And it's so many California kids, right? So 12 of their 15 commits right now are from California. And then the other thing that I was worried about, though, is when you have some of those offenses, it can be tough to recruit on the line of scrimmage because you're so invested in the skill positions, and offensive linemen are going, I don't really just want to pass block the whole time. Like, I want to run block. I want to have fun. I want to blow people off the ball. But 7 line of scrimmage players are committed to SDSU right now. That's almost half of their class. It's 5 linemen, a defensive lineman, and then an edge player. So I think they're doing a good job getting a diverse class in terms of positions, which is something I was worried about. And they're taking advantage of being in San Diego and hitting those California kids.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be your biggest pool of players when you're in the California area. And, you talked about how the coaching staff has had an effect on that. And I think that's a big thing in college football that sometimes maybe fans don't take the time to realize is, think about a coaching staff or when a new coaching staff comes in and mainly the focus is on the field, but they can change your recruiting process and success like that. Just coming into the school with their pedigree, their name, or, the way that they do things. And that can completely shape the players you're going to bring into your team for the next 5 years. And you're seeing that in San Diego State. So good for them.
I think that's such a good point, Connor, because they're coming off of their coach being Brady Hoke, who was running this power offense from 2005, right? And that doesn't mesh super well with California. And so now you get to see them reap the benefits of saying, okay, we have a lot of skill talent in this area, and that's our recruiting base. Dude, let's go and have an offense that requires and utilizes really good skill talent. It just makes sense. Yeah. And so I love the change-up that they're doing there. 2 other teams that are really changing it up in terms of recruiting. The first one's going to be Liberty. The second one's going to be Memphis. These 2 teams are the only ones in the G5 with 4-star recruits committed right now. So Liberty got Jalen Coleman, who is a 5'8", 155-pound athlete from Puma, Louisiana. He's ranked 366th nationally by 247, and he had offers from schools like Florida State, Arkansas, Missouri, Oregon, Ole Miss, and Tulane in state. So a really impressive offer list for someone who ended up choosing Liberty. So really, really good for them. And when you talk about coaches coming in and changing atmospheres and changing recruiting, I think you have to put Jamey Chadwell there, right?
Oh, you definitely do. And I think for Liberty or any G5 program, although I'd say maybe Memphis less so than even Liberty, just because I feel like Memphis has a bit of a bigger name and brand. For Liberty to be able to say, okay, wait, we can pilfer some recruits from teams the likes of the names you just listed that Coleman had offers from. That's a huge sign. Like, obviously, you'll take the win of the player that is Coleman, but I think also that's a sign like, okay, we can throw our name in the ringer for recruits that do have offers from serious schools. Like, that doesn't mean that it's just no-go zone for us. We can still try to win these battles. And obviously, whatever that entailed for them to convince Coleman to make the decision to come to Liberty, that's a good formula, and hopefully they continue to use that. Memphis, you'll talk about in a second, they also nabbed a 4-star, and That team, man, that's a football program that looking pretty scary.
It is. It is. They're really utilizing the resources that you mentioned they have. Their four-star is going to be QB Antoine Hill, who committed from Houston County High School in Warner Robins, Georgia. Many remember that's where Jake Fromm played his high school football. It's a historic power in the state of Georgia. And he was ranked as the number 174th overall player in this class. He is the highest-rated recruit committed to a G5 school right now by far. He chose Memphis over Florida, citing playing time as a big thing for him, which, listen, I think we can kind of connect the dots of Seth Hennigan being in probably his last year and Antoine Hill stepping in and hopefully being able to take over for that Memphis team. But just another huge get. Anytime you can get somebody that is in the top 200 as a G5 team, especially at the position of quarterback, you go, yes, please.
Yeah. I think it's also a good move for Antoine, for him to cite playing time. Yeah, I think in the current climate of the college football area, why not do that? Because, like we said, you have movement now at any point. So why sit the bench for 2 years at Florida when you can have two standout years for one of the best G5 teams in the country, coming off probably a year where they're going to be very successful under a great quarterback in Hennigan? Fill in for him right away in your first season, have success there, maybe do that for one more season, and then cash in, so to speak. That's just going to raise your stock even more than maybe it was at when you entered as a high school player. So I think it's a great move, and I think maybe if there's some hope for G5 programs, this could be a route you see more and more for four-stars that maybe aren't at the tippy top of the class, but are very good players that maybe they're not used to getting in the door as freshmen. But they might, and this is, I guess, a little unfortunate to say, but see some of these G5 schools as an initial stepping stone. Maybe not. Maybe they'll be ride or die 4-year players. But either way, I think it benefits G5 teams.
Yeah, hoping they stick. But as you said, with the amount of freedom players have right now, it is tough. And I think you hit on the perfect scenario, right? DJ Lagway in last class for Florida was the number 1 QB in the country, number 3 player overall. And it's just more fun to play. And so Hill goes, listen, I don't want to sit behind Lagway for 2 years, and then the next quarterback in the 2026 class for Florida is ranked as somewhere in the 110s. So he's like, listen, I'm just going to go and play and have a fun time. Memphis is a really good program. The uniforms are pretty sick. And be still pretty close to home. So good on Antoine, and hopefully he will stick for the 4 years, but we will see. Moving on into the meat of the episode, as I said, ranking the G5 conferences in football. So just to set the table for you guys, this is Bill Connolly's rankings using his SP Plus, the power ratings. This is how he ranked the conferences. It's going to go Sun Belt with an average power rating of negative 7.1. The Mountain West at number 2, which surprised me a little bit, with a negative 8.4 power rating. The AAC at a negative 9.1. Conference USA at negative 11.4. And the MAC at negative 12.8. So that is how Bill Connolly sees it. Sun Belt number 1, Mountain West number 2, American Athletic Conference number 3, Conference USA 4, and the Mid-American Conference number 5. But we're not doing his list today. We're doing our list. So, no. Connor, starting off with you. Who do you have as your number 5 conference? We'll go from back to front.
Yeah, let me get up the graphic I have here, and then
make it easier on the viewers.
We haven't talked about this at all. So, nope. Tyler, I think we've got to come to an agreement here. I think we've got to have it the Take 5 list officially. So we'll have to talk through some things. For me, I do have a bit of a disagreement with the list you just mentioned. I think it's close, but Conference USA I have in at 5, personally.
I also had Conference USA at 5, so we can go ahead and put them there.
Sweet.
And one other thing that we didn't talk about a criteria, because I wanted to see how each of us perceived what conference strength is. So can you talk about what put Conference USA at 5 for you?
Yeah, I think it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. For Conference USA, they were so top-heavy. And top-heavy, I mean, really one team in Liberty.
Right.
Besides that, it's a whole lot of nothing, to be honest with you. And maybe some schools will surprise me in that Conference USA mix, but judging off last year's success and the players they brought in for 2024-25 as well, I don't think there's a whole lot to write home about. Western Kentucky could be a decent program. New Mexico had an okay year last year, but they're losing quite a bit as well. New Mexico, so I have Conference USA pretty securely in at 5, just because I think the team above them has a little bit more depth. They might not have a team as good as Liberty this upcoming season, but I think they've got some more depth down the board.
Yeah, the depth is really what killed Conference USA for me as well. I tiered it out into Tier 1, which I put teams that are competing for the G5 playoff spot. Tier 2 is 8+ wins, so you're going to be somewhere in that probably 8, 9, or 10 win range and near the top of your conference competing for a conference championship. Tier 3 is bowl teams, so in that 5 to 7 win range where you narrowly miss out on a bowl or narrowly get into a bowl. And then Tier 4 are bottom feeders. And so when I look at Conference USA, I got Liberty as the one playoff contender. I don't think any other team has the talent to be able to do that.
Yeah.
In the Tier 2, I had Jacksonville State because I love Rich Rod, man. I think he is perfect for this lower level football. He is going to blitz you. He is going to score points. And I think in their second year in Conference USA, I just see them going up. And then I put Western Kentucky, but as you said, man, they're losing a lot, right? They're losing Malachi Corley, who was first-team All-CUSA. They're losing Austin Reed as well. That one is kind of teetering for me where I think they'll win 8 games, but I really don't know. And then the only other bowl team I have is Middle Tennessee State.
Yeah.
All the other ones for me, New Mexico State lost their almost entire coaching staff and so many players. UTEP is replacing their coach. FIU had a really bad year last year, and I didn't really see anything in looking at them that makes me think they're going to take a leap. Louisiana Tech is in a bad spot as well. And then Kennesaw State, it's their first year in the FBS. So with all of that, I just see this as, I see it as you do, an extremely top-heavy conference with not much depth throughout.
Yeah. I ask you, is there any team that you think might, maybe not rival Liberty in a sense of really match them in power, but be a solid number 2 team at least and give Liberty some good games in conference this year? Do you see any teams?
Yeah, I think Jacksonville State is someone that can do that. Again, the uniqueness of their offense, I think gives defenses a lot of trouble. And then I do think they're probably going in as either the second or third most just talented team on paper in the CUSA. I also forgot to mention Sam Houston State that I had as another bowl team. I don't think they'll compete with Liberty, but they lost so many close games last year in their first year coming up from FCS. I think they'll take a leap from, they went 3-9 last year. I do think they'll be more in that 6-6 range as another team that is ascending in the CUSA.
Absolutely. Who do you got at 4?
So at 4, this is where I had the MAC.
Me too. Yeah, I got the MAC here.
Yeah. So this is another conference where I think they only have the one playoff contender, Miami, Ohio, and that hinges on, as we talked about in episode 2, I believe, Brett Gabbert needs to stay healthy. If he does, I think it's a very talented team and think they are the cream of the crop in the MAC. And they're the cream of the crop in the MAC because I had no Tier 2 teams. I don't think anyone is going to be in that 8+ win range, which is kind of similar to how the MAC shook out last year as Miami, Ohio won 10+ games. Everyone else was in the 7 win range. And so bowl teams, I have Ohio, Central Michigan, and Bowling Green, NIU, and Eastern Michigan. And then bottom feeders of Buffalo, Akron, Kent State, Western Michigan, and Ball State. So this is a team with no middle, really, at all for me. It's the really tip top of Miami, Ohio, and then I think Toledo will be in there as well, and everyone else is just going to be fighting to make a bowl.
Yeah, no, to your point, only 3 teams reached double-digit wins in 2023 for the MAC, and they finished with 8 teams with losing records.
Yep.
And I don't think a lot of those teams got all that better. They haven't been a lot of teams in the MAC we talked about over our last couple episodes here as we get ready for the upcoming season. And when it comes down to it for me is I do think if you looked at who has the best team out of the Conference USA or the MAC, I do think it's Liberty and CUSA. Yes. But then I think if you look at, okay, besides that, if you went down the board and said the second best team in the MAC plays the second best team in Conference USA, the third best team in the MAC plays the third best team in Conference USA, all the way down the board, I think the MAC is coming out with a lot of wins in that department. I just think even the mid or bottom feeders of the MAC are quite a bit better than a lot of the teams in the Conference USA for this upcoming season. So it can be hard to say, I'm going to put this team over Conference USA when I think Conference USA has the best team. But I do think even the weaker parts of the MAC would have pretty good games against even the middle of the Conference USA teams.
Yeah, and I will say I think this one was very close, and it was closer than I expected, because when you hear people talk about the CUSA, it's just trashed completely.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it's quite as bad as everyone thinks it is, especially compared to some of these other conferences. But I do think it is the worst.
Yeah. And when you get rid of these two teams at the bottom, which I think were no surprise, they were going to be 4-5 in some order. This is where I think it gets really interesting, Tyler. I could honestly see almost any variation of the top three shaking out in a certain order with whatever argument you might have, and it not be absolutely preposterous. These three conferences all offer something different. It was tough for me to separate the top three.
You took the words out of my mouth. It was tough because there's a lot of good teams scattered throughout, and I think we'll get to it, but there's some differences in the conferences where one has a lot of really, really good teams and is missing that middle a little bit, and the other two are just deep and have some of those top teams, but really you see the strength of the conference in that 8 to 6 win range of being really good and really deep. So who did you have number 3?
This is controversial. I don't think we're going to stick with my 3 here.
Okay.
But I just really like some of the top programs in the next two conferences. And I think that the overall strength of this conference will take a step down this year compared to last year. I had the Sun Belt here at 3.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I know.
That is, yeah. I think they were the one team out of these 3 for me that I only had one playoff contender, and that's App State. Everyone else, they had a decent amount. They had the most, actually, in the 8+ win range, because I think that speaks to their depth. But you're right, as far as the top teams in each conference, they don't have the amount that some of the other, like the Mountain West and the American Athletic Conference do.
Yeah. For me to sum up my argument on it real quick, I would say, well, you could say, well, you have Conference USA at 5, and they have a really good team at the top, and that's true. I think for the AAC and the Mountain West, and I haven't even said how that order is going to end up, but for both of them, I think they have really good programs at the top. Memphis and Boise State, and there's a couple others that are also very good. But also down the board, I think the level of competition is far better than the Conference USA. So it's not just they have a really good team, they're the best. It's they have a really good team. And also, I do think there is some meat if you look at the middle of the pack in these conferences. Where for Sun Belt, I think it's just going to be a case of regression in 2024. I really do. I don't think James Madison's going to be nearly as good as they were last year. App State will be good, but I don't know. I'm not completely sold on App State as far as comparing them to other G5 powerhouses this season.
Right.
I don't know. I know it's a hot take, and we definitely don't need to stick with it, and I'm sure you've got some thoughts, but that's where my head was at.
Well, I don't think it's preposterous at all, man. I agree with you about a lot of what you said. I had JMU taking a step back. They were in my tier 2, and I really was going back and forth of whether they were going to be a bowl team or A+ win team. Overall, I just really like their coach, Bob Chesney. He was super good at Holy Cross. But even with that and that belief, they are going to take a step back. They're not going to win their division, I think. Their 8+ win teams, I had Louisiana, Texas State, Arkansas State, and JMU. And then they just got a lot of bowl teams, man. Coastal Carolina, Old Dominion, Troy, Georgia Southern, Georgia State. But I don't actually mind us putting them at 3 here the more I look at it because of the step backs where you say JMU is going to take a step back. I think that Troy, we talked about in our first ever episode, is going to be one that takes a step back. Coastal Carolina has been taking steps back. And I could definitely be sold that, hey, they just don't have it after Chadwell leaves and they lost Grayson McCall. Same thing, Georgia Southern. I mean, Clay Helton's on the hot seat, man. If they don't have a good year this year, he might be gone. Georgia State lost their quarterback, who was very good. And then you have those bottom feeders, Southern Miss, Louisiana Monroe, and Marshall are not in great spots. So I actually, the more I look at it, I had them at 2, but I think you've convinced me to put them at 3.
Okay. All right, we'll put them at 3. Yeah, I don't know. It'll be interesting. We could look pretty silly with some egg on our face by the end of the season, but I don't know. I think the Sun Belt, a lot of the teams in the Sun Belt surprised people last year. JMU definitely. I mean, I think everyone knew they were going to be a good team, but as good as they were, I think that was a bit surprising.
Right.
I think App State really impressed, but I don't know. I think it might be a case of now they might be a little overhyped coming into this next season. We'll see. That could be too far, but.
Well,
you
you're
have
hitting
it
on question marks for sure. For number 2, that then moved the Mountain West into that spot for me.
I agree.
Yeah,
that's what I had.
So, excuse me, the 2 playoff contenders I had was Boise State, and then the more I look into this Fresno State team, I really like them.
Yep.
And so I actually had them as a playoff contender as well, and I think that's going to be the conference championship game is going to be Boise State and Fresno State.
For me, I'll say this: the thing that convinced me, the last straw to move Sunbelt to 3 and Mountain West to 2, was I did a little bit of a deep dive into Fresno State, and I was like, okay, wait, there's a team here.
Yep.
We know about Boise State. I mean, we've talked about them a lot. I ranked them very high on my list as far as G5 teams. I think I even had them at the top.
Yep, number 1.
That's not going to carry you all the way when you're ranking a conference, but seeing some number 2 team, a number 3 team that I could actually get behind, and then when I started putting them against what I thought a Sunbelt, some Sunbelt teams might look like this season, I was like, okay, wait, I could see them beating that team. And that kind of brought me more around to Mountain West. They do get helped out a lot for me by Boise State, because I think Boise State are going to be world beaters this season. I think they're going to be really good. But, yeah, I had them at 2.
Yeah, I think I just love Jeff Tedford as a coach, because I looked into him, and he had a winning record at Cal. He won almost 60% of his games at Cal. I cannot describe to you how hard that is to do. And then to come into Fresno State, and they got Mikey Keene coming back. They have 73% of their production back overall on offense. And then I like some of the defensive guys they brought in to help out a defense that was below average last year. And so if they can get that defense from, it was 98th in EPA, if they can get that more into the 70s range, I think they're challenging Boise State and are a good number 2 team. A couple other teams to watch. I had UNLV. I think they're going to be very good, even with losing their quarterback to USC. Wyoming is just always such a tough place to play, man. They're going to beat you up. They have the wind in Laramie. It's always going to be a very good team. And then Colorado State is a team I have taken a step, mostly because their quarterback, Braden Fowler Nicolosi, there we go, was a true freshman last year and played pretty well for them. Needs to cut down on the turnovers, but that's what true freshmen do, right? And so I think they're going to be very good next year as well. And Utah State has a bottom feeder, as we talked about. I don't think they're going to be able to recover from losing their coach.
Yeah, probably not, which is the unfortunate thing, because they were a team that could have been a little bit higher up your board without that. Probably not super high ceiling for Utah State, but they had a decent group, and that staff did have success. Taking a look at our number 1 team, it is the AAC. For me, when I think of the AAC compared to these other teams or these other conferences, for the Mountain West, you got Boise State, which I think is going to run away with things. You got Sunbelt, who I think is just a case of regression down the board. The MAC is a lot of mid, unfortunately. Yep. And then Conference USA is a really good team, and then a lot of bad. For the AAC, Memphis is a great program, so I don't want to say that Memphis isn't the favorites, because they are. But you look at this conference, and I feel like there is some really good programs littered at the top, where it feels a lot more competitive than the Mountain West, where you feel like this is actually a conference where you have multiple very good programs that all have a chance at battling it out for a conference title at the end of the season, where for the Mountain West, it kind of feels like it's going to be handed to Boise State. You could say the same for Conference USA. The Sun Belt and the MAC, maybe less so, but I think that's more of a case of who is actually good in these conferences, or really good in these conferences, compared to we know what we've got in the AAC, and they're just going to be battling it out.
Yeah, they had the most playoff contenders when I looked at it. Tulane, Memphis, and USF, I think, all have a shot to come out of the AAC as the G5 playoff representative. And I almost had UTSA there, because I love Jeff Traylor, and I love what he's done. But losing Frank Harris, Josh Cephas, a couple of those guys, just had them down in that 8+ win tier. I don't think they're going to be bad. I just don't know if they're going to get to that level of the Tulane, Memphis, and USFs. And like you said, they're just deep. I think FAU is going to have a good year under Tom Herman, the former Texas head coach. There's some really good coaches and coaching staffs in this conference to where I can even trust them. Like, hey, they might not be that top tier good, but they're not going to bottom out either.
Yeah. And for the AAC, this is them in the top spot, even after, and correct me if I'm wrong, but losing SMU to the ACC this year, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And SMU is a very good program, who was their final AP Top 25 team last year at 22. Mm-hmm. So that's a credit to this conference that you lose one of your top dogs from one season ago, the top dog, you could say, and you still end up as the number one G5 conference. There's some heavy hitters in the AAC.
There are, man. It's going to be so fun. And a lot of these teams obviously play each other. So, watching them battle it out in the regular season and then maybe even get a second chance in that conference championship game, I'm looking forward to it, man. It's going to be a really, really fun conference to keep up with.
Tyler, any final thoughts on the list? I know Sunbelt at 3, Mountain West at 2. Definitely know what you had envisioned coming into today. So any final thoughts?
Yeah, there's not a ton for me that I would change. Like I said, I thought that the Mountain West Sunbelt was the biggest decision I had in terms of which ones to put where. So when you were able to put together a good argument for me, I was like, all right, listen, I can see that, right?
Yeah.
I think for me, I was going to even ask you if there's a conference that you can see taking a leap this year. And for me, I think it is the CUSA. I do think with them bringing in a bunch of different teams, and a lot of the teams that were really, really good last year, like Jacksonville State, they are now in their second year of FBS. I think they could take a leap. Middle Tennessee State brought in Derek Mason, former Vanderbilt head coach. I like that. And, Kennesaw State, we'll see. Can they be the Jacksonville State of last year to where they come in and just start ripping off wins? And you're like, wait, I thought this was going to be a 4-8 team. And all of a sudden they're 8-4. I can see a world where the CUSA doesn't rise into that third spot. I think that 1 through 3 is pretty set in terms of which conferences they will be in a certain order. CUSA, though, I think could slide into that 4th spot if the MAC disappoints or if Brett Gabbert gets hurt.
Yeah, I agree with you. If I had to pick a team to jump a team, it would be Conference USA over MAC, because like we said, I think it's already really close. And you look at Kennesaw State, maybe not for this season, but they're in a pretty good recruiting area. If they can pull some recruits from that Georgia area, I don't know. They could be interesting going forward. But yeah, I can see Conference USA jumping the MAC, or I can't really say that for any of the other teams, besides maybe the Sun Belt over Mountain West, but that might not be unlikely in a lot of people's opinions. For me, if I had to take a conference that I think improved the most from last season to this year, it'd be the Mountain West, I think, for me personally.
Yep.
Now, it might be a conference that we expected them to take that jump after all the additions Boise State got, but that conference, to me, when I think of Mountain West, I think of basketball. And I think you look at this last March Madness tournament, you got a lot of Mountain West teams in there. They play some good basketball up there. But the football side of things, that doesn't really come to the equation a whole lot, or it hasn't for me in the past. But this season, you've got some really good programs in the Mountain West. Boise State, of course, headlining it. Fresno State has a good chance. UNLV is a good club. So I think those guys all coming together, I don't know. I think that they could turn some heads by the end of the season. And again, I talk about recruiting. Sorry to cut you off.
No,
on
you're
last
good.
thing.
You're good.
Teams in the Mountain West, I think that Pacific area is, again, a hotbed of talent a lot of the times.
Totally agree. There's a lot of players that you can get from the California, Nevada, Oregon, Washington area that slip through the cracks for those P4 teams that are in that area, and they're still really good players. For me, the other thing when you talk about the Mountain West, it's a lot of teams with the arrow pointing up. We talked about San Diego State and Sean Lewis being their new coach. I think that's an arrow up team. Even New Mexico got Bronco Mendenhall, who has proven himself as a really good G5 coach, but UNLV, arrow up. Colorado State, arrow up. Fresno State, arrow up. Boise State, even coming off of, by their standards, a disappointing year, arrow up. So
Definitely.
I totally agree with you when we say that the Mountain West is the most improved of these G5 conferences.
Yeah. Mountain West, they've got some good programs, but once again, for us, it's the AAC on top. I don't think it's much of a surprise. At least for me, I was pretty sure what I was going with at the top.
No, and that's, I think when we look at Bill Connolly's list of him having the AAC at number 3, that was what really surprised me. And I know for him, it's just the raw ratings and putting the averages together. And so I can see, like, for the AAC, I had 5 teams, in the bottom feeder tier. And so I can see, okay, even though you have tops, them being the ECUs, Temples, Army, Navy, Tulsa, them having ratings in like the 120s to 130s in relative to the rest of the country. I can see how that pulls it down math-wise, but that really did surprise me.
Yeah, it surprises me too. But if you're going off just numbers, no opinions, no kind of reasons for the numbers,
Right.
Sure. I could see why maybe the bottom of the pool brings down their average. But I do think they are the cream of the crop when it comes to G5 conferences this season. And I feel like they have been for a while now. So,
Yep, especially pulling, we talked about it last episode, but pulling some of those Conference USA teams that were really, really good for Conference USA, and then they get into the AC and even add to the depth. So talk about UAB, Charlotte, North Texas, people like that. Just really kind of strengthens the conference even when you lose an SMU and teams of that nature that are very, very good.
yeah, that makes me think, Tyler, what do you think the chances, and we talk about Conference USA teams who could be looking to make a jump eventually, when or if do you think that could be a possibility for Liberty? I'm pretty positive they would jump at that chance if they got it.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a possibility, and if so, what time frame?
I think it is. Right now, they are locked into a grant of rights agreement with Conference USA, and that was signed for 5 years last year. So at least 4 years, they are locked into giving their rights, their media rights, to Conference USA. Now, I will say Florida State and Clemson are working out of getting out of their grant of rights deal for the ACC. If they find a legal argument that can get them out of the ACC's grant of rights, now we're talking about, okay, instead of it being, hey, you are in this USA for at least 4 years, now can Liberty use that legal argument to get out of CUSA if they wanted to jump into the AAC? I'm just picking one out, or Sun Belt, right? They have some rivalries in there in the Sun Belt Conference, and just being in the South and in the quote-unquote Sun Belt, I think would be good for them. Or at that point, are we going into stuff that we don't love, but where it's the Super League and then the not Super League or whatever we would call it? Could they get out of the grant of rights at that point and be a team that has enough investment to hop into that Super League when it does actually form? So it'll be interesting right now, because I haven't seen any legal argument that could get you out of a grant of rights deal that you signed. The timeline would be at least 4 years for me. Yeah. But we will see, and that Liberty fans need to be keeping an eye on Florida State and Clemson and how they are able to solve their problem.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. You would think at a certain point, although Conference USA, I'm sure, likes having Liberty in their conference for when they go to the bowl games, when they do stuff like that. But, I mean, if they had to sit out 4 years of Liberty in the conference and things remaining as it is around Conference USA, which I think it would, man, that's going to be a lot of Conference USA titles and a lot of ugly games. So yeah. I don't know. It's interesting. It's interesting when you think of Conference USA's side of things to balance the two. We have this team that's kind of running through the conference, but at the same time, we have a team that's getting us a lot of publicity and making pretty good runs. And especially now with the conference playoff, or the college football playoff system, with the top G5 team going to the college football playoffs, there's a chance there's a Conference USA representative in that boat this year, which, I mean, if Liberty's not part of that conference, you absolutely can't say that.
Right, and I was going to say, I think the conference is okay with it because of the money that comes from just getting into the playoff, right? Or even the money last year that comes from getting into a New Year's Six bowl.
Right.
They are okay with that. Now, if you asked each individual's team's athletic director, they might be a little less okay with that.
Yes.
But then they get the conference payout, and they're like, okay, an extra $1 million is pretty cool, right? So It's kind of a both and when you look at that. But I would caution everybody into just saying that Liberty is going to run through the Conference USA every single year, because you see that in different G5 conferences. It is generally more volatile than Power 4 conferences, where you do know that the helmets of Alabama's and Georgia's are going to be really good. As a Florida fan, I can tell you, right, we are on an amazing run with Urban Meyer and Tim Tebow, and people think it's never going to stop, and it's going to be just Florida out of the East every year against Alabama out of the West. And Urban Meyer has health issues, and Tim Tebow leaves, and the next coach is not able to do as well. And so programs do rise and fall, and I'm not calling for this, but does Jamie Chadwell leave Liberty, right? That changes a lot of things. So I know it looks like Liberty is going to dominate the CUSA for however long they're in it right now, and I think I would even tend to agree with you, but there are things that happen in college football that you just really cannot predict.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And especially the point about Jamie Chadwell potentially leaving for greener pastures. I think it's kind of inevitable at a certain point with the talent that he is, and even as someone who would say they are a Liberty fan, I would hope for him to do that at a certain point. Like, I think the sky's the limit for Jamie Chadwell in college
really
football,
good coach.
or potentially even beyond. So yeah, at a certain point, you got to do what you got to do. But when it comes to the Conference USA and Liberty, the reason why I might feel pretty comfortable saying that, saying their dominance over the years potentially, is I just think when we talk about the recruiting classes of these G5 teams,
Yeah.
like we have, Liberty tends to come up with one of the teams that are doing pretty well, and no other Conference USA teams do. They just don't. Now, if they were in the AAC, if they were in the Sun Belt, if they were in the MAC, then it's like, yeah, we're taking it year by year. And you still do have to take it year by year. But in the Conference USA, not only does it feel like Liberty right now is by far the strongest team, but when you look at what their prospective team should look like in a year's time, it seems like that's only going to continue, and that gap might even widen just because of what they're pulling in.
Yeah, just speaking to that point, right now, Liberty has the number one high school recruiting class in this USA, and their points rating, which is what 24/7 gives to rank your class, and that's how they get the team rankings. Liberty's at 81.07. The next closest is Louisiana Tech at 57.38, and then it drops all the way down to FIU at 16.19. So the recruiting, and I'm not even looking at the transfers, but the transfer class, they had the number one transfer class in Conference USA again last year. You're right, it does speak to their ability to pull in talent, which is the name of the game in college football.
Yeah, so I think Liberty could have a down year by their standards, and still, when they look around them at the Conference USA, and I'm just trying to be realistic, and this could change in 4 years, and it's really hard to predict down the line that far, but it's just, the talent isn't there for a lot of the teams yet. But who knows? Things could change. Realignment's always a possibility, so who knows? In 3 years, this could look completely different, and everything I could be saying is null and void, but for now, I don't know. It seems like Liberty's going to be pretty hard to unseat at the top.
Yep. And we will be checking that out all through 2025, and hopefully we even go beyond that.
Yeah.
Keep Take 5 together as long as possible. But thank you guys for listening. Connor, thank you for doing this with me. We will probably throw that list out on some of our social medias just for you guys to look at, debate. I will be cutting clips from this podcast as always. You can check out the full episode on Spotify. You can look up Take 5 Tyler Hill or Take 5 Connor Young to find us, and you can download the episode and listen. I know a lot of people are taking vacations right now, so if you're on a plane or driving in a car, go ahead and throw it on and listen. But yeah, thank you guys for listening, and have a great rest of your day. God bless.